Hi, I'm Brian Reardon, President of the S Corporation Association. We appreciate everybody joining us today. Our guest today is David Winston. He is the president of the Winston Group, which is a strategic planning and survey research firm based here in DC. S Corp vets would recognize David. He's presented to us before. He's done survey work before. And this time around, with all these very significant tax hikes on the horizon, we asked David to once again go out and poll voters and ask them what they think about these policies, both in general and also some of the specific policies that are being considered by Congress. So David's going to give a short presentation, and then we will have a Q&A session. If you go down, you can see there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Click on that, type in your question, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, David Winston with the Winston Group.
Okay, Brian, do you see that?
Yep, we're good.
Let's take a look in terms of just sort of the outlook on the business environment. And this is something that we had done before in previous surveys with Brian and the organization, where we took a look in terms of what people believe certain entities are paying currently in terms of taxes, and what people believe should be the maximum amount. And so let's start with the are paying. You can see that they view public corporations at about 19%, wealthy individuals about the same at 19%, individually and family owned businesses slightly higher at 21%, and small businesses at 22%. So you can see that the sense that small businesses and individually and family owned businesses, there's the perception at this point paying slightly more than corporations and wealthy individuals. When you jump to the maximum they think they should be paying, you see they view corporations, the maximum should be about 24. Wealthy individuals around 30, and that's been consistent with the number that we've tested out over time. I'm sure that all those individuals would be very happy to be at 30%, but that gives you a sense of where the electorate sort of sees this sort of maximum and how they sort of look at what seems reasonable. Notice that in terms of individually and family-owned businesses, they think it should be lower, 4% lower, and the same thing for small businesses also, in both cases 17%. With that, sort of getting into how taxes and regulation impact being able to start up businesses, first starting with taxes. The level of taxes on business makes it difficult for the average Americans to start their own businesses. 63% believe that. And when you get to regulations, you see that 62%, virtually the same number, believe that it makes it difficult for Americans to start their own businesses. And so that's clearly seen as an obstacle. When you ask the question broadly, does the federal government understand the needs and challenges of individually and family-owned businesses? What you see again here is by a 2-to-1 margin, people do not believe that the federal government understands the needs. And another question we asked, do you think in terms of how the government responds to businesses, both small and large corporations versus small businesses, there's a sense that they have a better interaction with large corporations and understand and help them more than small businesses. And part of this goes back to this particular question, because there's just not an understanding in terms of the challenges that exist for family and individually owned businesses. The impact of the tax proposals, we asked if companies have to pay more in taxes, those costs will be passed on to consumers in higher prices. 2/3 believe this. This is pretty consistent across the board. People realize when businesses pay more taxes, ultimately they're going to pay more as well. In thinking about the impact of raising taxes on inflation and cost of living, would increasing taxes on businesses cause prices to increase, decrease, or would this have no impact? And again, you have 63% saying it would increase, only 11% saying no impact. For some reason, there are 9% out there who think it would decrease. Again, pretty consistent with the previous question in terms of dealing with just overall that they would be passed on to consumers.
Hey David, can I ask you a question about that? Because it does seem like inflation is in the headlines right now. The CPI number that we had last week was the highest we've had in years. This seems like it's something that would resonate both with voters but also on the Hill. this idea that if they're going to raise taxes on businesses, it's going to accelerate this whole inflation concern that we have and that's already presenting itself.
Yeah,
Am
no,
I missing something? Is this kind of a
no,
key response?
yeah, no. I mean, at this point, the whole cost of living dynamic is a really challenging environment. In fact, one of the things, interesting enough, Anita Dunn went to the Hill today to talk to Democrats, and one of the things that she was discussing was, so how do you keep costs down for middle class families and working families? So the administration is certainly aware of this challenge in terms of how their economic policies are being perceived. And they have to be seeing similar numbers in terms of the level of concern that exists here in terms of, again, not so much this slide, but this slide in terms of people just expecting those costs to be passed on, 65%.
And it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If people believe prices are going up, that could actually encourage prices to go up.
Not how do I say this? In terms of being an economist, in terms of people willing to accept higher prices because because the expectation is may occur, that's certainly potentially a dynamic. But I'm going to tell you right now, this isn't perceiving it that it might be going up, because they really are seeing it, and where they're really seeing it is at the pump at this point.
Right.
And part of that is because to your point, there was an expectation when some of the pipelines were cut off that was going to occur, and when it did, that people were able to sort of piece those together and view that as an inflationary outcome. With that, the other thing that they do understand, although not at the same scale, is if a business has to pay more in taxes, it will not be able to raise wages for its employees. I mean, there's an understanding, you only have so much money, and if you're giving some of it to the government, that means it can't go to wages. Obviously, in this environment where people are looking for significant increases in wages in terms of moving forward as they try to return to work and sort of make up a lot of their lost wages, this is not a small item by any sense. So the specific look in terms of tax increases, and this is, we had asked this question in a prior survey and got virtually the same response. It's unfair to tax the same business net income twice. 80% agree with that. Just to give you a sense, independents, the political center, agree with this 73-7. So this is a pretty, even Democrats overwhelmingly agree with this, that this basic idea is very much something that people say yes to. Corporations and wealthy individuals are not paying their fair share of taxes. 53% believe that, 25% don't. Now, I want to make a distinction here. When you're talking about fair share, that is an abstraction of this question. If you remember on the previous slide, people said the maximum should be 30, and we'll get to what's actually being proposed, which is well above that. So sort of generically, people sort of feel like, maybe that's not there because they're hearing narratives about what happened with Amazon, Bezos personally. The release we saw a couple of weeks ago, somebody getting a hold of all the IRS returns for a lot of wealthy individuals, and the way that was presented, i.e. that unrealized income they were trying to attribute as actual income for taxable purposes, which obviously it isn't. But understand there's a narrative here that is going to have to be constantly dealt with, i.e. not paying their fair share. When you get into the details, and you'll see here in a second, this shifts a bit. With that, getting to the proposed tax increases, raising the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. You see that people favor this 51 to 34. Again, I go back to, if you remember in the slide I showed you earlier, the sense the maximum rate should be 24. So there's at least some sense that maybe it should go up, whether it should be 28%. Obviously, you see some disagreement here. But again, to some degree, the idea here is there's an openness to this. But again, you're just barely at a majority of 51%. When you look at increasing the capital gains rate from 23.8 to 43.4 on gains over $1 million, what you see here is initially 44% favor, 36% opposed. When you say if you did this, that it would also apply to individually and family-owned businesses and farms, you see it actually become negative at that point. Only 37% favor, 45% opposed. So this particular tax proposal, if put in the context of family and individually and family-owned businesses, people will oppose it by 8 points. Even at 44% favor, there's a way to go to putting together a majority coalition. And what you're going to see here in terms of these next proposals is the fact that there is not majority support for these yet. Eliminating the 20% business income deduction for individual and family business owners making more than 200,000. Again, you see it 41% favor, 35% opposed. When they understand it applies to individually and family-owned businesses, that drops to 39-36. The takeaway in terms of this, in both cases, this proposal is well short of 50% putting together a majority coalition and very close in terms of favor and oppose.
Hey, David.
Yep.
So we were just chatting earlier that, these numbers obviously include Democrats, Republicans, and independents. What's the independent breakdown for this one? Because in my mind, that would be the key audience of who favors and opposes.
Well, initially, in terms of the initial, it's 34-34. But once independents realize when you lay out it would apply to individual and family-owned businesses, independents oppose it 29-40. So one of the things, to your point, Brian, is that this is something where context is very important. But even so, in terms of independents being at 34-34, that means you have a third favoring it, a third opposing it, and a third undecided. When you have a proposal that you're trying to, particularly one as large as this, when you have a proposal where you've only got a third of the country supporting it, you have a lot of work to do to make that work. That's going to be very hard to drag over the finish line, at least in terms of the electorate. Again, having said that, you have an unusual, as you well know, an unusual dynamic in terms of where Congress is at this point. But having said that, this is not something that is even close to even being acceptable yet to the American electorate, which doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but at least gives some positive context in terms of being able to engage on this issue. And here we go back to, again, where we were describing before, dealing with the wealthy, and while people say paying their fair share, and I showed you that 30% mark earlier on, when you actually get to talking about raising the top tax rates, you can, from 37 to 39.6, you can see initially 40% favor, 43% opposed. When it will apply again to family and individually owned businesses, that goes to 34-38. To give you 34-48, to give you those two numbers again amongst independents. Initially amongst independents, it's 34-44, and would apply to individual and family-owned business. It goes to 27-49 by 22-point margin. Independents would oppose, knowing that particular context. With that, part of what Brian wanted me to take a look at was just this, as we deal with this issue of basically the double taxation, the double death tax, and transference of family businesses and farms from one generation to the next. We just posed the broad question initially, which of the following statements comes closer to what you believe? If you're rich, you should be able to pass your wealth on to your children. If you're rich, you should be able to pass on a limited amount of wealth onto your children. Before I go to the numbers, I did this specifically to say, if you are rich, to sort of try to create the most difficult context. Nonetheless, 2/3 of the country said that you should be able to pass your wealth on to your country, and you had a quarter who said you shouldn't be able to, or it should be in some limited form. Which of the following statements comes closer to what you believe? If you own a business, you should be able to pass it on to your children without having to pay a tax on the appreciated value of the company, versus if you own a business before you your children could take it over, they should have to pay taxes on the appreciated value. And again, this is where we're sort of getting into unrealized income or wealth. And you can see, again, not dissimilar from the previous question, 2/3 of the country believes that you should be able to pass it on without having to pay a tax on the appreciated value. Then we went through some scenarios to just see how people would respond. If you started a business that ended up being worth $5 million and you left it to your children, would it be fair or not fair for your children to have to borrow the $2 million to pay the federal and state capital gains taxes so that they could keep the company? And you can see that 60% said that it wasn't fair, only 26% fair. Again, getting to those independents, that number ends up being only 15% fair and 66% not fair. Then looking at the double taxation proposal, there's a proposal that after an individual dies, their estate would be subject to 2 layers of tax. First, the appreciated assets in their estate would now be subject to a higher 43.4 capital gains tax. Then the remaining estate would be subject to the 60% estate tax. And again, you get a very similar number to the previous one, 25% favor, 59% oppose. And again, going to independents, very similar as the previous one as well, 16% favor, 65% oppose. Finally, in terms of looking at the additional capital gains tax on businesses whose value has increased over time in addition to the current estate tax, that this would force family business owners to sell their business rather than pass them on to their children. 57% believe that, 21%, so almost 6 out of 10 Americans believe that these cap gains would negatively impact families being able to pass their businesses onto their children. But this gets to, and I want to get to sort of a broader sense, and this goes back to the first couple of slides, and the environment that people are now in as a result of COVID and having shut the economy down and now trying to get everything working for everybody. We posed this, believe not believe, we need to do everything we can to help businesses and individuals get back on their feet so they can get Americans back to work and keep the economy moving in the right direction. And again, overwhelmingly 63, almost 2/3 believe that, 17% don't. And so what clearly the country is looking for are those policies that's going to, in fact, allow those businesses that have, in many cases, had to struggle significantly, be able to move forward so we can sort of move back to people being able to get wages again, get back to the wages they had before, try to make up wages they lost, and begin to move forward. And the only way we're going to do that is through the private sector. And so they're looking to do as much as we can to, again, help businesses and individuals get back on their feet. So with that, Brian, be glad to go to questions.
Thank you, David. That was excellent. Really appreciate you doing the work, and it's gratifying, at least for me, to know that the sort of the America that I know still exists. It's not, we haven't turned the page on this idea that you can build up an estate over your lifetime, build up a business, and then pass it on to your kids. That used to be something that's been applauded and encouraged. Lately, when you read the press or you see some politicians, they seem to have a completely different idea. And yet when you ask voters the very question, is it a good thing for people to build up an estate, pass it on to their kids? Overwhelmingly, they support it. So that sort of fundamental idea of the American dream still exists. At least that's what I'm reading in this. Is that correct?
Yeah. One of the things, and going back to the election and looking at exit polls, one of the things that I think people misread was the ideological direction the country was headed in. And I think there was a sense that, particularly given a lot of the stuff around what Bernie Sanders was saying and a lot of what some Democrats were saying, much to the chagrin of those centrist Democrats that we were just talking about, like Spanberger and Lamb. We're not particularly happy about some of the other things that some other Democratic members were saying, was that, in fact, from 2016 to 2020, actually the country shifted slightly to the right. In 2016, when you looked at the electorate, conservatives had an advantage over liberals by 9 points. And in 2020, that margin increased to 15. So actually the country shifted slightly to the right in terms of where people were viewing things and where that sort of center rightness is really focused on is in fact economic issues. And I think this survey, you see that clearly reflected those viewpoints.
Okay, thank you, sir. So there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. If you would like to ask a question, just click on that and type it in. Alex, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have a few coming in here. This is from the chat box. More general, what kind of audience was polled here? General public or select group of people knowledgeable about business and economic policy? Generally, who did you survey, David?
It was just 1,000 registered voters, and the reason for that is not surprisingly, the idea is to be able to sort of show policymakers where the country's at, and given those policymakers, they're interested in registered voters. So it's 1,000 registered voters nationally.
And in terms of the party breakdown and stuff like that, how did that come out?
That came out, again, what you get is Democrats have a slight lead over Republicans. And there's, but basically the sequence is you got Democrats being the largest group, Republicans slightly behind them, and then you've got independents slightly under 30%, around 28%, 29%.
And for me, the test was you did ask, the approval of President Biden's performance so far, and it came back at about 52%, I think, which is
it was
pretty consistent with other polls.
Yeah, it was very much in line with the other polls.
So I think the bottom line is the goal was to have an accurate representation of the voters out there, and see where they're really at.
Yeah,
questions? Good.
To give you the exact, it was 52% approved, 38% disapproved. So it was plus 14 for Biden at that point. He is, and that's in line with other recent surveys as well.
Other questions, Alex?
Yeah, this is interesting. David, is there a response or two from the study that A, surprises or jumps out at you the most, B, has changed the most over time, and or C, that differs from other studies that you've conducted or read about?
I'm going to give that to you in a slightly different variation. Rather than saying what was surprising, I'm going to give you what was interestingly consistent. Okay, and the one number, first off, starting off with the fact that we had posed that question about whether it was fair or not fair in terms of taxing business income twice. The fact that it was almost exactly the same number as the last one, I thought was interesting, which meant, to your point, that people understood the question, right? When you come back and get the other one too is going to that wealthy number, the max for wealthy. We have asked that in a variety of different ways, and it virtually always comes back the same number at around 30%. And what that tells me is there's some consistency in the electorate in terms of how they look at these issues that isn't sort of a short-term dynamic. What I think that should say to you and the group here is, as you're thinking through these policies, there is some consistency and a viewpoint that allows you to sort of strategically plan into as you're thinking of moving forward. And again, in terms of the other questions, you saw that as well. Again, let me go to the top right as an example, and making that distinction between the sort of narrative of paying their fair share and the wealthy and corporations versus when you actually put a proposal in front of them with numbers. You can see how the electorate can make those distinctions. And so I think the other thing it says to everybody here is sort of going back to the Ross Perot line, the devil's in the details. I think to some degree, the opportunity here is be very clear about the policies being talked about, and that's actually beneficial.
Thank you, David. Other questions, Alex?
Yeah, this one is blunt. Why do voters dislike the estate tax so much?
It's the thing that's interesting. Again, I actually have quite a bit of respect for the electorate. I think that they're much better at making decisions than I think a lot of people give them credit for. They may not want to pay attention to the particular issue that you want, right? That's a different challenge. It's up to individuals to make sure that they can make whatever they're talking about engaging to the electorate. but there's also just an inherent sense of fairness that I think the electorate has. And that is that this idea that, you've worked all your life and you want to, leave something for your kids. That's not a negative, right? When you think of the inverse, right? So is what's being proposed by having a large estate tax, what the government is saying is if you spend it all on yourself, that's okay. Then you can do that. But if you decide you want to leave it to your kids, well, then you got to pay a big tax. People kind of get that logic. They sort of understand that, and there's just a sense of fairness. If that's what you wanted to do, you should be able to do it. And that's an inherent sense of fairness that people have out there.
All right. Well, we've got two here that kind of get to the same point, but I think it's important. I'll try to roll them into one. How do we account for other polls in the media that show wider support for tax increases? Is there a difference in methodology, for example?
It's sort of a difference. Well, in some cases, there's a different methodology. If there's one thing that I would encourage everybody to do, anytime you look at any national level poll, look at the party identification. And one of the things that happened in terms, and actually this just came out of the recent, the American Association of Public Opinion Research just did a review of all the public polls prior to the 2020 election as to why there were so many problems. And one of the elements they came up with was the fact that the party ID, which is what Brian was talking about, how many Republicans in the survey, how many Democrats, favored Democrats by too wide a margin. And so therefore, you were getting margins that were larger for Biden as well. And so one of the things you need to look at is just how wide is that margin. Historically, the largest we've seen has been was Obama, and I believe, if I get this right, it was 7 points. It was 40% Democrat, 33% Republican, and that was in that was the McCain race in 2008. So that's one thing to look at whenever you look at a survey. What is the party ID? The other thing too is, again, and I go back to, do you think the wealthy and corporations are paying their fair share? You saw that was favorable by a double-digit margin, 51% favoring that. Yet when we got to the actual increasing that percentage from 37 to 39, you saw that people opposed it 40 to 43. So what you need to do is look at the question: are they specifically laying out what the details are, or are they just sort of laying out a sort of broader narrative that people could say, yeah, actually, maybe they should be, maybe they aren't paying their fair share. So look at questions from the point of view, is it specific so that people can make up their mind around something, or is it just a sort of broad generalization?
Anything else, Alex?
That is the end of the list.
I would like to put an exclamation point on the last point that David made, which is, as the question infers, the Biden administration has been pushing very hard on this idea that their tax plan, their what they have in their American Families Plan, is popular with the voters. And I think you see in these questions here that if you just simply ask, well, should the wealthy pay more? Do you support raising taxes on the wealthy? Then you'll get a majority of voters saying yes. But that's where it's important, as David says, to ask one, well, how much should the wealthy pay? What's the most they should pay? And what you find is that the voters are very reasonable, and what their answer is well below what the wealthy are actually paying right now. And then when you say, oh, here's the actual proposal that's on the table, and these questions are actually, in my mind, the rates are a little soft in the sense of, if you add up all these rate hikes that they have proposed and then add in the state levies as well, you're looking at marginal rates that are well over 50% for many businesses in many states. And that's way out of sync with where the voters are at. That's not even close. And that's what shows here, is that when you do talk about the specifics, support for these plans goes down dramatically. And that's the message we're going to take up to the Hill, and hopefully I think it'll resonate. It's resonated in the past. This is quality work, and I think it'll have an impact this time around as well. David, any closing remarks?
No, I just feeding off of one point. One of the things also to look at when you're looking at these surveys, and that's why I was bringing it up pretty consistently in the presentation, is, you have the two parties' political bases behaving like you would expect them to, but where the sort of the rubber meets the road is with independents. And so when you're going around and looking at those individuals who are trying to work through this issue, and the sort of members who wouldn't be considered the sort of hardcore base of either party, and therefore are looking for information to better understand where the electorate is, they're going to be looking to one key group, and that's independents. And so the reason I was mentioning that, and you could see in with a lot of these proposals where independents were very much center right, and that's where, as you're thinking through this, and as Brian goes to the Hill, members are going to be looking at that particular group to sort of understand where things are going.
Well, David, you've been a good sport, and we really appreciate the work you put into this and the time to present it to the membership. I'm sure we will be speaking again in the future, but we really appreciate it.